She lost her chance to be a mother, then gained a daughter in the most unexpected way. Abandoned by her husband, judged by his family, she chose love over blood and built a family from heartbreak. But just when her life felt whole again, a knock at the door changed everything. Who was the man claiming to be the baby's real father? And what did he want? Where are you watching from? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories. I never thought silence could hurt so much. That kind of silence that fills a room and squeezes the air from your lungs. That's what it felt like the moment Dr. Klein said the words I had always feared but never truly believed would be mine. I'm sorry, Elena. We've exhausted every option. Your condition is irreversible. You won't be able to conceive. The office was warm, quiet. Rain tapped gently against the wide glass windows behind her desk. It should have been a comforting sound, soft, rhythmic, but it felt like a cruel rhythm beating time on a dream that had just died. I sat frozen, my hands clenched around the armrests of the chair like I was bracing for impact. I should have seen this coming. After 5 years of shots, hormone crashes, surgeries, hope, and heartbreak, some part of me already knew. But hearing it said aloud turned possibility into permanence. I looked at Dr. Klein, a kind woman with soft eyes and a tired smile. She'd seen this outcome play out more times than I'd care to imagine. She reached across the desk and placed a hand on mine, gentle and clinical. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just asked the question I already knew the answer to, my voice barely audible. There's nothing else we can try? She shook her head. Anything more would only put your body through more stress, Elena. I know how badly you've wanted this. But it's time to think about healing. Healing. What a strange word. As if this was a clean cut that time and rest could mend. As if a deep, cavernous absence could be patched like skin. I nodded, thanked her, stood on autopilot, and left. I don't remember much about the drive home except that I took the long way. I passed Willow Lane, the street with the big park I used to avoid like it was cursed. Mothers pushing strollers, toddlers tumbling off jungle gyms, kids laughing with ice cream dripping down their wrists. That day, I drove slow. I made myself look. Maybe I was punishing myself, or maybe I needed to know that life went on for others even when it came to a full stop for me. Greg wasn't home. He was in Chicago on a business trip. I should have called him, should have told him what the doctor said. Instead, I walked into our house and went straight to the nursery. The room we painted soft yellow 2 years ago when we first believed this could happen. There was a crib, a rocking chair, a bookshelf stacked with unread bedtime stories. It looked like a room waiting for a ghost. I sat in that chair and stared at the stuffed elephant we bought at a boutique in Asheville during our first anniversary. Greg had held it up with that goofy smile of his. For good luck, he'd said. We didn't know then what was coming. How many maybes we'd whisper in that room. How many times I'd stand in the doorway hoping to feel something, anything, but only hearing silence. The tears came slow at first, then all at once. Not the kind that hope carries with it. Those stubborn tears that fall after a failed treatment and a whispered, maybe next time. These tears were heavier. Final. The tears of a chapter closing, of a body surrendering. I must have stayed in that chair for hours. The sky outside turned from gray to black. Streetlights flickered on. Still, I didn't move. I thought of Greg and what I'd say when he called. I thought of what this meant for us, not just for me, but for him, for our marriage. Would he be relieved, angry, compassionate, distant? The phone rang, slicing through the quiet like a blade. My body jolted. Reflex. I always answered, just in case it was a doctor with some miracle I hadn't expected. This time it wasn't. Is this Elena Harper? A woman's voice asked. She sounded professional but nervous. Yes, I said, standing up slowly, trying to steady my voice. This is St. Jude's Medical Center. You're listed as the emergency contact for Amaya Carson. The name hit me like a wave. Maya, my best friend, or used to be. We hadn't spoken in 3 months, a slow fallout. Life had pulled us in different directions, but once upon a time, she was everything. My roommate, my sister in spirit, the only person who knew the full weight of what I was going through. She's been in an accident, the woman said. A drunk driver. She's in critical condition and asking for you. I didn't ask questions. I just said I'd be there. My coat was still in the chair. I threw it on, keys in hand, and drove like the road was a string pulling me toward her. Hospitals always smell the same. Antiseptic and grief. The nurse met me in the ER lobby, guiding me through corridors that felt too long. She spoke in a hushed voice about internal bleeding, broken ribs, a punctured lung, but all I heard was, "She's asking for you." Maya looked small in the bed, too pale, too still. Wires and machines clung to her like armor, but she was losing the battle. Her eyes fluttered when I said her name. "Elena," she whispered, and smiled through pain. I took her hand. "I'm here." She barely had strength to speak, but when she did, her words cut through everything else. Promise me you'll take care of Grace." Grace, her daughter, 3 months old, the baby I'd never met, the baby I'd only seen in blurry Instagram stories I tried to ignore out of bitterness. "Maya, what about your family?" "They won't take her," she said. "They never accepted her or me. You're the only one I trust. I named you guardian. It's all in my desk drawer. The will, the lawyer's card. Please, promise me." I didn't hesitate. "I promise," I whispered, my voice cracking. And just like that, everything changed. The sun had begun to set, casting golden light through the hospital window, and Maya, always the poet, smiled at it. "I always loved sunsets," she whispered. "They make everything feel like it might be okay." I stayed until the machine slowed, until her hand fell limp in mine, until she was gone. And I had never felt so full of grief, or so full of purpose. In the space of a day, I had lost one future and been handed another. I didn't know what Greg would say. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had made a promise to a dying friend, and no matter the cost, I was going to keep it. I barely slept that night. Maya's voice echoed in my ears long after the machines had gone silent. I kept hearing her say, "Take care of Grace," over and over again, like a haunting lullaby. I drove home with my knuckles white on the steering wheel, not because of the rain or traffic, but because I knew, deep down, I had just stepped into a new life, and nothing would ever be the same again. The house was quiet when I walked in. It felt foreign, like I didn't belong there anymore. I stood in the kitchen, my coat still damp, the smell of hospital soap clinging to my skin, and stared at the life I had built with Greg. The expensive countertops, the framed wedding photos, the absence of toys, bottles, or baby socks. My eyes landed on the untouched nursery down the hall. And that's when I realized this house wasn't waiting for a child anymore. It had stopped hoping a long time ago. I was the only one who hadn't noticed. I spent the rest of the night pacing, making lists in my head. Bottles, diapers, crib, car seat, baby clothes. I didn't have any of it, and I had no idea how to prepare. I hadn't even held Grace before. Maya had pulled away after giving birth, and I had been too wrapped up in my own grief to push harder. Now I would be the only mother Grace had left. At dawn, I showered, changed into jeans and a sweater that didn't smell like tears, and made my way to the sitter's house. Maya had left Grace with a kind woman named Ethel, someone she'd trusted while returning to work part-time. The house was a small bungalow with a garden of overgrown lavender and sun-faded wind chimes dancing in the breeze. It smelled like cinnamon and baby powder inside. "I heard," Ethel said softly as she opened the door, her face heavy with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Elena." Maya was. She adored that little girl. My chest tightened. "I know." She led me to a cozy room at the back of the house where Grace lay in a portable crib. Tiny legs kicked at the air. A fuzzy pink blanket had slipped off to the side. When I stepped closer, she looked up, wide-eyed, then smiled. A toothless, heart-splitting smile that felt like it cracked something open inside me. "Hi, baby girl," I whispered. My voice caught, unsteady. "I'm Elena. I'm here now." She reached one hand up, fingers curling around nothing, and that was all it took. I knelt beside her, scooped her up, and held her against my chest. The warmth of her, the weight, the way her head tucked beneath my chin, it was like I'd known her all along. Ethel gathered Grace's things while I sat with her, memorizing her smell, the curve of her ear, the sound of her soft cooing. Diapers, formula, wipes, 2 little onesies, a stuffed hippo, and a half-used bottle of baby shampoo. It wasn't much, but it felt like everything. "She's a good baby," Ethel said as she zipped the diaper bag. "Maya talked about you all the time. She said if anything ever happened, you were the only one she'd trust." I blinked back tears, kissed Grace's forehead, and nodded. "I won't let her down." When I got home, I realized I hadn't thought through how I'd carry her and open the front door. Eventually, I managed it, Grace propped on one hip while I fumbled for the keys. As soon as we stepped inside, I paused. The house, with its quiet corners and echoing walls, suddenly felt too big, too empty. I carried Grace to the guest bedroom, our old office, and laid her on the daybed while I turned the space into a temporary nursery. The crib wouldn't arrive until tomorrow, but I made do with rolled towels and soft blankets. I washed her bottles in the sink like they were made of crystal. I checked the formula instructions 3 times before mixing her first bottle, then held it at just the right angle as she drank, her little eyes staring up at me like I was the whole world. By the time the sun began to set, I was exhausted. My back ached, my arms were sore. My heart felt like it had been peeled open and stretched across the room. But for the first time in years, that ache inside me, the one left behind by every failed attempt, every empty pregnancy test, was gone. In its place was something terrifying, beautiful, and real. I was someone's mother. That night, as I rocked Grace to sleep, I hummed, "You Are My Sunshine," in a voice I didn't recognize as mine. She fell asleep in my arms before I reached the second verse, her breath soft and steady against my shoulder. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, afraid the moment would vanish if I did. And then the phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Greg. A rush of cold swept over me. I answered, "Hey." "Alina," he said, cheerful, unaware. "How did it go yesterday? What did the doctor say?" There was a pause. I could hear the clinking of silverware in the background. He was probably at dinner with a client. I imagined him in some steakhouse, laughing, drinking a glass of wine while I sat in the dark rocking the child of my dead best friend. "I can't have children," I said softly. The line went quiet. "Oh," he said, the cheer gone. I'm sorry." "There's more," I continued, my voice growing steadier. "Maya, she died yesterday. Drunk driver, and before she passed, she asked me to take care of her daughter." Grace. I didn't expect silence. I expected questions, concern, even shock. But what I got was something else, an edge in his voice I hadn't heard before. "You brought the baby home?" "I had to," I said. "She named me guardian in her will. It was her last wish." "You couldn't have waited until I got back?" he snapped. "Elena, this isn't adopting a puppy. This is someone else's child." "She's not someone else's child," I said, the heat rising in my chest. "She's Maya's, and she's mine now." Greg let out a frustrated sigh. "This is not what we talked about. You should have called me. We make decisions together." "This wasn't a decision. It was a promise," I said. "And I made it. I'm keeping it." There was a long silence. Then, "We'll talk when I get home." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a while, then looked down at Grace, still asleep in my arms. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the soft hum of the baby monitor. I whispered into the dark, "He just needs time. He'll come around." But even then, part of me already knew the truth. Greg had been drifting away for months. We'd become 2 people clinging to the same routine, hoping routine would carry the weight of love. He wanted a child, his child. Not this one. Not someone else's. But Grace wasn't someone else's. She was mine now. And I would fight for her with everything I had. Greg walked through the front door 3 days later, suitcase in one hand, phone still pressed to his ear, barking something about spreadsheets and deadlines. He stopped cold when he saw me in the living room, sitting on the floor in leggings and an old college hoodie, bouncing Grace on my knee while she gurgled happily at the ceiling fan. He blinked, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "So it's true," he said flatly, lowering his phone. "You really brought her here." I stood slowly, shifting Grace to my shoulder. "She didn't have anyone else, Greg. She needed me." "No," he said, his voice hard. "She needed a guardian. That doesn't mean you uproot our entire life without talking to me. I tried to tell you." "No, you informed me." He cut in, setting his suitcase down with a thud. "Over the phone. While I was in the middle of dinner with investors." "She was dying," I said, my voice rising. "She was begging me to take care of her daughter. What was I supposed to do? Say no? Wait for you to finish dessert?" He ran a hand through his hair and paced the room. This is unbelievable." Grace whimpered, sensing the tension. I swayed instinctively, whispering in her ear to soothe her. My body moved on instinct now. Motherhood had carved itself into me faster than I'd imagined. Greg pointed toward the hallway. You moved her into the office? She needs a place to sleep. That was my office. Not anymore. He stared at me for a long beat, jaw tight, eyes colder than I remembered. You've made a hell of a mess, Elena. I didn't respond. There was nothing else to say. That night, he slept in the guest room. I stayed up with Grace, feeding her, singing softly, watching her sleep like it was the only thing tethering me to the ground. Every breath she took, every soft sigh, she didn't know her world had been split in two. She just needed warmth, safety, love. By morning, Greg had made his decision. I called my parents, he said over coffee. They're offering the lake house. You should stay there for a while. Give us time to figure this out. I stared at him, trying to understand. You want me to leave? You brought this child into our marriage without my input. You changed everything, Elena. You mean I kept a promise, I said. I stepped up when no one else would. He didn't look at me. He took a long sip of his coffee, then added, We'll split assets according to the prenup. I'll keep the house. I laughed, cold and bitter. You already have the house, Greg. I'm the one carrying a diaper bag and wondering how I'm going to afford formula on my own. Greg flinched slightly, but recovered quickly. You made your choice. No, I said, my voice shaking. You're making a choice. To walk away. He stood and grabbed his keys. My parents will come by later to help you pack. And just like that, he was gone. When his parents showed up, they treated me like a tenant being evicted. Margaret, his mother, was already rearranging the nursery in her mind, suggesting I leave the crib because it might not fit in the lake house. Grace clung to me, wide-eyed and quiet. I held her close and whispered promises I wasn't sure how to keep. I didn't have a job lined up, no childcare, no plan. But I had her. I had my daughter. I packed in silence while Margaret stood in the doorway and offered backhanded condolences and veiled judgment. You must understand, Elena, this is a very big step, taking in someone else's child. She's not someone else's, I snapped. She's mine. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Legally, that's debatable. I took a deep breath, pulled the zipper on the suitcase shut, and turned to face her. Maya named me Grace's guardian in her will. There are documents, lawyers, it's already in motion. Still, she said with that tight, polite smile of hers, Greg never agreed to raise another woman's child. No, I said quietly, but I did. And that was all that mattered. By the time I strapped Grace into the borrowed car seat and closed the trunk, I was shaking. Not from fear, but from clarity. I wasn't walking away from a marriage, I was walking toward something new. Something terrifying, yes, but real. Unconditional. We moved into Trish's spare room later that afternoon. She was a coworker I'd bonded with over years of team lunches and holiday parties, but I hadn't expected the warmth in her hug when we arrived. Whatever you need, you stay as long as you want, she said, waving off my nervous apologies. Seriously, I've got a futon, a microwave, and a stash of chocolate for emergencies. I laughed for the first time in days. It felt foreign and beautiful. That night, Grace wouldn't settle. She cried inconsolably, and I paced Trish's hallway in the dark, bouncing her, humming softly. Exhaustion clung to me like wet clothes, but I kept going. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart anymore. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I held her in my lap on the futon and whispered, It's just us now, kiddo. But I promise, I'm going to give you everything I have. She looked up at me, blinking slowly, and I knew in that moment, no matter how hard it got, I would not give up. I would build something from this rubble, for her, for me, for Maya. The next morning, I made a list. Crib, diapers, formula, a job, a new apartment, a new beginning. I had no roadmap, but I had a purpose, and her name was Grace. Life didn't wait for me to catch up. The first few weeks in Trish's spare room were a blur of midnight feedings, diaper changes, and whispered lullabies. Grace, ever the mystery, cried in unpredictable rhythms like a code I hadn't learned to crack yet. Sometimes she slept peacefully for hours. Sometimes she screamed for reasons beyond formula or comfort. I read every parenting forum I could find at 3 a.m., clutching my phone with one hand and rocking her with the other, praying I wouldn't break down before she stopped crying. Trish was a godsend. She never judged the chaos that came with us, just adjusted to it. She brewed strong coffee before I even asked, left clean towels outside the bathroom door. And once, when she came home to find me crying in the laundry room with spit up on both shoulders, she simply sat down beside me and handed me a peanut butter sandwich. "You've got this," she said. "You just don't know it yet." It became our new rhythm. Grace and I shared the tiny bedroom, her portable crib tucked into the corner beneath a poster of a beach Trish had never visited. I used a laundry basket as a changing table and folded her onesies on the futon we slept on. Every inch of that room smelled like baby powder and sleep deprivation, but it also held something sacred, survival, and slowly, something even stronger than that, love. One afternoon, Grace reached for my face while I fed her, her tiny fingers brushing my cheek like she knew I needed reassurance. That single gesture sent tears streaming down my face, and I laughed through them. "It's okay," I whispered. "We're going to be okay." I began documenting our journey on a whim. A simple blog post, written on Trish's old laptop while Grace napped beside me. I titled it, "The Unexpected Mother." It was raw and messy and filled with spelling errors, but I hit publish anyway. I didn't think anyone would read it, but they did. Strangers commented, women who had fostered children, men who had adopted nieces, widows raising grandchildren. They thanked me for being honest, for showing the unfiltered truth of what it meant to become a parent overnight, not out of planning but out of love. Within a week, my post had been shared dozens of times. Someone called it a letter to every woman who ever thought she wasn't enough. I cried reading that, because that's exactly how I'd felt, like I wasn't enough. Not for Greg, not for motherhood, not for myself. But Grace didn't see it that way. She never looked at me with judgment, only with trust. That trust built me back from the inside out. The blog gave me something I hadn't had in weeks. A voice. A sense of control. I poured myself into it between bottle washes and nap routines. I wrote about loss, about marriage, about how it feels to build a crib at 2 a.m. with shaking hands and hope in your chest. I wrote about Maya, her laugh, her wild stories, how fiercely she loved Grace. I kept her alive in the only way I knew how, through words. I also started to take steps toward rebuilding. I applied for emergency family leave from work. My boss, Michael, surprised me with his warmth. "Take the time you need," he said. "We'll be here when you're ready." That small kindness cracked something open in me again. Not everyone was like Greg. Not everyone ran when life got messy. One morning, Rachel, the quiet HR manager I'd barely spoken to in 2 years, called and offered her cousin's contact. She manages a small apartment complex, not fancy, but clean, and she has a one-bedroom that just opened up. I didn't hesitate. I took Grace to see it that afternoon. It was tiny. A galley kitchen, a sunlit living room just big enough for a futon and a baby swing, and a bedroom where Grace's crib would barely fit. The walls needed paint, the faucet dripped, and the carpet had seen better decades. But it was ours. I signed the lease with shaking hands, used a chunk of my savings for the deposit, and moved in that weekend with Rachel's help and Trish's hatchback. We filled that apartment with borrowed furniture, hand-me-downs, and love. Grace's crib went by the window. I bought a second-hand bookshelf for the children's books Maya had once joked would make Grace a genius by 4. I found a thrifted armchair and called it my new rocking chair. At night, when the city quieted and Grace drifted off to sleep with her stuffed hippo tucked under her arm, I sat in that chair and wrote. Each word was a brick, each post a beam, and slowly I built something resembling a home. The apartment may have been small, but inside it bloomed a life I never thought I'd have. Grace began babbling, laughing, reaching for me in the mornings like I was her sunrise. Her first giggle nearly undid me. She was teething, chewing on a frozen teether, when she made this high-pitched squeal and burst into a full-on laugh. I froze. Then I laughed too, loud and full and unfiltered. "You're ridiculous," I told her. "And perfect." Rachel kept checking in, sometimes with casseroles, sometimes with advice. One evening, she brought her boyfriend to help assemble a second-hand dresser. "This girl's going to be running the place by the time she's 2, he joked, watching Grace try to climb the laundry basket. That night, I sat at the edge of my mattress on the floor, watching Grace sleep in her crib, and I realized something I hadn't dared to say aloud before. I was happy. Not in the way I once imagined. Not with white picket fences or a perfect marriage or holiday cards with coordinated outfits, but in the way that meant something deeper. I was doing it, on my own, with help, yes, but with no man beside me, no shared bank account to fall back on, just me and her. Greg had filed the divorce papers. I signed them without hesitation. No dramatic confrontation, no final plea. Just paperwork, initials, and silence. He had chosen his path, and I was choosing mine. On Grace's 6-month birthday, I wrote her a letter in the blog. "You may not remember this time in your life," I wrote, "but I hope you always carry the feeling of it, that you were safe, that you were wanted, that your mama, both of them, loved you more than the stars could count." That letter went viral. I woke up to hundreds of messages, some from strangers, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. One read simply, "This made me believe in family again." It made me believe, too. We had no traditions yet, no big backyard, no father-daughter dances or bedtime stories read by two voices, but we had soft light spilling across the crib. We had lullabies sung in the dark. We had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early spring, the kind where the sunlight spills lazily across the living room floor and the world feels gentle again. Grace was on the rug, clumsily stacking plastic blocks and knocking them over with delighted squeals. I had just sat down with a cup of tea, finally catching a breath, when the doorbell rang. I frowned. No one ever dropped by unannounced. Rachel always texted first. Trish had a key. My family was, well, they hadn't called since Christmas. I peeked out the window and saw a man standing on the porch, late 30s maybe, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of posture that said military without him having to say a word. He wore jeans and a button-down, clean but simple. Nothing about him was threatening, but something about his presence unsettled me, like the air before a summer storm. I opened the door cautiously, keeping one hand resting on the frame. Grace toddled over, clinging to my leg and peeking out from behind it. "Can I help you?" I asked. He shifted his weight, eyes flicking from me to Grace and back. "Are you Elena Harper?" My pulse picked up. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "My name is Jack Carson." His voice was low, careful. "I think we need to talk. It's about Grace." I went still, my breath caught halfway in my throat. Grace's small hand tightened around my jeans, and I instinctively pulled her closer. Jack's voice softened. "Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. I only found out a few months ago. About Maya, about Grace. I didn't move." The name hit me like a wave. "Maya never told me she was pregnant," he said quietly. "We were together briefly before I deployed. I tried to stay in touch, but she stopped responding. I figured she'd moved on. I came back from Afghanistan 3 months ago, tried to find her, and instead I found an obituary. I found out she had a baby. Our baby." I studied him, my heart thudding against my ribs. He didn't look like a liar. He looked tired, hollow-eyed, like someone who'd been chasing a truth and wasn't sure he wanted to find it. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. "Her neighbor told me about the accident. The hospital. I tracked down the lawyer from the guardianship paperwork. He said you'd adopted her." I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. "We're finalizing it, soon." Jack nodded. "I'm not here to interfere with that. I'm not asking for custody or to take her away. His voice cracked a little. "I just wanted to meet her. Once. To see her. To know she's okay." Grace, with her usual toddler timing, chose that exact moment to wave her arms and yell, "Hi." Like she'd just met a new playmate. Jack blinked, smiled. His eyes watered just a little. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed to protect her, to shield our little life from anything unknown. But the man in front of me wasn't fighting. He was asking. And I knew, deep down, that Maya would have wanted Grace to know the truth, someday. "Okay," I said. "Not today, but maybe soon." He nodded, relief washing over him like sunlight. "Thank you. I'm staying nearby, working at the VA clinic. Actually, I'm a PA now. If you're open to it, I'd love to meet you both in the park sometime." "No pressure." I gave him a small nod. "I'll think about it." He smiled again. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was a grateful one. "That's all I can ask." When I closed the door, my hands were shaking. Grace had gone back to her blocks, unbothered. I sank onto the couch and stared out the window, watching Jack walk away, every step carrying 100 things left unsaid. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, his eyes when he looked at her. That flicker of recognition, of awe. He hadn't claimed her. He hadn't demanded anything. He just wanted to see her. Maya had never mentioned him by name. She'd simply told me in those last gasping moments that there was no one else, no family, no father, just me. Had she been trying to protect Grace? Or herself? Or maybe in her own way, she'd been protecting Jack too. The next morning, I called Rachel. "I think Grace's biological father found us," I said, the words tumbling out faster than I expected. Rachel was quiet for a beat. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Do you believe him?" I paused. "I think I do." "Then what do you want to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want? I spent the next few days thinking about it, watching Grace, writing, reading old messages from Maya, trying to balance the weight of the past with the reality of the present. Jack hadn't forced his way in, he'd knocked. That mattered. Saturday morning arrived, crisp and bright. I packed a small bag, snacks, toys, a blanket, and dressed Grace in her favorite overalls. As we left the apartment, I glanced at my phone and texted a number I'd saved but hadn't touched. "We'll be at the park, 10 a.m., near the swings." He replied within seconds. "Thank you. I'll be there." We arrived first. Grace ran straight for the sandbox, plopping down with her usual fearless energy. I laid out the blanket and tried not to fidget. He appeared a few minutes later. No uniform, just jeans, sneakers, and that same nervous expression. He approached slowly, like he didn't want to startle us. Grace spotted him and tilted her head. "Hi again," she chirped. Jack smiled, knelt down near the sandbox, and waved back. "Hi, Grace, I like your shoes." She held one up proudly, displaying a smudge of dirt. He chuckled, and I felt something ease in my chest. He didn't try to pick her up. He didn't force a connection. He just sat with us for a while, watching her build a tower of sand, laughing when she knocked it down. "She's incredible," he said softly, glancing at me. "You're doing an amazing job." "Thank you," I said, barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to mess that up," he continued. If there's room in her life, even a small one, I'd like to be part of it." I looked at Grace, dirt on her cheeks, determination in her eyes. Then at Jack, quiet and steady, waiting for an answer without demanding one. And I thought, maybe it wouldn't hurt to try, just a little. "I can't promise anything yet," I said. "But we can start with this." He nodded. That's more than I expected. We stayed an hour. He pushed Grace on the swings, slowly, gently, always looking to me for permission. She laughed louder than I'd heard in days. As we walked home, Grace asleep in the stroller, I realized something. This wasn't the beginning of a custody battle or the end of our peace. It was the start of something I hadn't planned for. But maybe, just maybe, Grace needed this chapter too. And maybe, so did I. Saturday mornings became our ritual. It started with simple visits. Jack would meet us at the park near our apartment, always arriving a few minutes early, like he couldn't wait to see Grace again. He brought small gifts. A pinwheel, bubbles, a plastic butterfly net she was too young to use, but loved waving around like a magic wand. He never overdid it. He never tried to impress, just small, thoughtful things. He paid attention to what she liked and remembered the details. At first I kept my distance. I watched like a hawk. Every word, every touch, every expression. I waited for the other shoe to drop, for some hidden agenda to appear behind his warm smiles and gentle voice. But it never did. Jack didn't want to control anything. He didn't ask about custody. He didn't push for time alone with her. He simply showed up, consistent, steady, patient. Grace, in all her toddler wisdom, took the lead. She decided when to hand him a toy, when to crawl into his lap, when to call him Jakey with that squeaky sing-song delight that only a child can make sound like a royal title. Jack didn't rush her. He waited, and Grace, sensing that patience, bloomed around him. I remember the first time she fell asleep in his arms. We'd been at the park longer than usual. She'd chased birds until her legs gave out and climbed slides with reckless abandon. I was packing up the stroller when she reached for him, eyes heavy with sleep. He hesitated, glancing at me. I nodded. He held her gently, her little head resting on his shoulder, and he swayed without thinking, just like I did at home. I froze mid-motion, watching the way his hand cradled her back, the way his eyes softened as he looked down at her. "You okay?" I asked. He looked up, his voice quiet. "More than okay? I didn't think I'd ever get this." There was something in his voice, grief, wonder, gratitude. And I realized then what I hadn't wanted to admit. Jack wasn't just doing this for show. He loved her. He truly did. Not because he felt obligated or guilty, but because she was part of him. And he had missed everything. Her first smile, her first word, her first steps. All stolen by timing and silence and war. He never once blamed Maya. He never spoke ill of her. He just grieved her in quiet ways, pausing longer than necessary over her photo in Grace's baby album, asking questions about her laugh, her favorite books, what lullabies she used to sing. I began to soften too. The more time we spent together, the more I saw the shape of the man beneath the grief. Jack was funny in a dry, understated way. He'd make Grace giggle by pretending her stuffed hippo could talk, or by dramatically reacting to her nonsense babble like it was the most serious political commentary he'd ever heard. He told stories about his time overseas, about his nieces and nephews, about his childhood dog named Waffles who once ate an entire shoe. He never asked personal questions, never pried. But when I shared something about Greg, about the divorce, about Maya, he listened like it was sacred. Then one afternoon my lawyer called. We were sitting at the cafe after a long park morning, Jack helping Grace build a tower of sugar packets while I sipped coffee. The phone buzzed. I stepped away to answer, my heart kicking against my ribs. The adoption's almost finalized, my lawyer said. But there's one last step. The court has identified Jack as the biological father. We'll need his written consent to proceed. My stomach dropped. I knew this was coming. It wasn't a surprise, but it felt like a line drawn in the sand. Can I call you back? I asked. She agreed, and I hung up, the world suddenly too loud. Jack looked up as I returned, sensing something in my face. Everything okay? I sat down slowly. The adoption hearing is coming up, but for it to be finalized, the court needs your formal consent. He nodded, like he'd already expected this. Okay, when do we sign? I blinked. That's it. Elena, he said gently, you're Grace's mother. You've raised her, loved her, protected her. I'm not here to disrupt that. I'll sign whatever you need. I meant it when I said I want what's best for her, and that's you. I didn't realize I was crying until his hand reached across the table, resting gently over mine. Thank you, I whispered. You don't know what this means to me. He smiled, eyes shining. I think I do. The next week, we met at the attorney's office. Jack read every page, asked careful questions, then signed his name without hesitation. But before he slid the folder back across the desk, he cleared his throat. There's one thing I'd like to ask, he said, looking directly at me. Not custody, nothing like that. I'd like to be legally recognized as her father, not to take anything from you, just to acknowledge that I exist, that I care, and maybe have some say in the big stuff, school, health, things like that. I studied him. There was no fear in his eyes. No selfishness, just sincerity. It was reasonable, fair, and truthfully, comforting. I think Grace would benefit from having you in her life, I said softly. So yes, I'm open to that. His relief was visible. Thank you. We added the request to the paperwork. Jack would be recognized as Grace's biological father, with no claim to physical custody but full visitation rights and a voice in major decisions. It wasn't traditional. It wasn't what most people would expect, but it was us. The family we were building, messy, unconventional, patched together with patience and late-night talks, was becoming real. Grace would grow up knowing that her father wanted her. Not because the law forced him to, not because anyone pressured him to, but because he chose her, because he kept showing up. The next Saturday, we didn't go to the park. We stayed in my apartment, playing board books and building block towers while Jack helped me make grilled cheese sandwiches. Grace sat in her high chair, throwing peas on the floor with gleeful rebellion. You know, I said, handing him a spatula, you're getting pretty good at this co-parenting thing. He grinned. I have an excellent teacher. I laughed, brushing crumbs from the counter. For the first time in a long time, my heart didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt grounded. Later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep and Jack had gone home, I stood in her doorway watching her sleep. The nightlight cast soft shadows on her cheeks. Her chest rose and fell in that steady, soothing rhythm I had memorized. And I thought about the future, about birthday parties and school plays and scraped knees, about Jack clapping in the audience, about me cheering beside him, about Grace growing up knowing she was loved by two parents, not married, not romantic, but bonded by something stronger. Choice. And I knew, without a doubt, we were doing the right thing. We were building something new, something whole, something Grace could grow up in and call home. The morning of the adoption hearing, the sky was clear. One of those rare, soft blue skies that feel like a blessing. I dressed Grace in a pale yellow dress with little daisies along the hem, the one Jack had picked out weeks ago during a weekend market. She twirled once in front of the mirror, then promptly sat on the floor and pulled off her socks. "You can be adorable or you can be barefoot," I muttered, chasing her down with a laugh. "But not both in court." Jack met us outside the courthouse in a pressed shirt and slacks, a small bouquet of wildflowers in hand. He handed them to Grace, who promptly tried to eat one. "Good start," he whispered with a grin. My nerves melted a little. Inside, the courtroom felt warmer than I'd expected. Sunlight filtering through high windows, wooden benches worn smooth from decades of hearings. Trish was there, Rachel too. Even Mrs. Chen from down the hall had shown up, wearing a church hat and holding a bag of lollipops in case Grace got restless. They weren't just friends, they were family. The kind you gather slowly, stitch by stitch, in the quiet chaos of new beginnings. When the judge read the order aloud, officially naming me as Grace's legal mother and Jack as her acknowledged father with full visitation and decision rights, I felt the final weight fall from my shoulders. It didn't make us more real, it made us visible. It honored what we'd already become. The judge smiled kindly at Grace. "Welcome to your forever family." She clapped, blissfully unaware of the gravity of the moment, then pointed at Jack. "Jakey," she said loudly. "Snack?" The courtroom chuckled. Jack nodded solemnly. "We'll get snacks after, Your Honor." Everyone stood. I gathered Grace into my arms and held her close, tears catching in my throat as Jack's hand rested lightly on my back. I turned and whispered to her, "You're mine now, always." That afternoon we went to lunch, just the three of us. Grace smeared mashed potatoes across the table and sang nonsense songs between bites. Jack raised his glass of iced tea. "To family," he said softly. "To choosing family," I replied. We toasted, we laughed. It was one of the happiest days of my life. So when Rachel called that evening to say a man had shown up at my old office asking for me by name, refusing to leave, I already knew. I didn't need to ask. "It's Greg, isn't it?" I said. "Yes," she replied, her voice tight. "He's been here almost an hour. Do you want me to call security?" I paused. "No, tell him I'll meet him at the cafe across the street. 30 minutes. I didn't tell Jack. I didn't want to cloud the day. Instead, I left Grace with Rachel, kissed her soft cheek, and walked into that coffee shop with my shoulders back and my chin high. Greg was already at a corner table, suit immaculate, a chai latte waiting in front of an empty chair. He stood when he saw me. "Elena," he said, like it was a question. Like maybe he wasn't sure I was still the same person. "Greg," I replied, staying on my feet. "Why are you here?" He motioned to the chair. "Please, just hear me out." Reluctantly, I sat. He pushed the drink toward me. "Still your favorite?" I ignored it. "Congratulations," he said. "I heard about the adoption. That's today, right?" I narrowed my eyes. "You've been following my life?" He shifted uncomfortably. "A little. I check your blog sometimes. I didn't know you'd see it grow like that. You write beautifully." "I write honestly," I said. "It's the one thing I owe Grace." He nodded, took a breath. "Alina, I've been thinking a lot about how things ended between us. I know I made mistakes, big ones. I was scared, angry. I didn't understand what you were doing, what it meant to you. I see now that I was wrong." I watched him carefully, measured. "Why now?" I asked. "After all this time?" He sighed. "I started seeing someone. It was going well. Then she said something that reminded me of you, and I realized I hadn't moved on. I kept comparing her to you. And I thought maybe, if we talked, maybe we could find our way back to something." I stared at him, not with anger, not with sadness, but with clarity. "We can't." He flinched. "I gave you a chance to choose this family," I continued. "You didn't just say no, you kicked me out of our house. You let your mother supervise me packing my life into boxes while I held a grieving infant." I panicked. "No, Greg, you decided, and I decided too. I chose Grace. I chose a life where love isn't conditional on biology or convenience." He looked away. "She's beautiful," he said after a long pause. "She looks happy." "She is." "And Jack?" he asked, the name sour in his mouth. "He's her father," I said simply. "Not because a court said so. Because he showed up. Because he loves her." Greg looked wounded. "Is it serious?" "We're not dating," I said. "But he's family. He earned that." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "My parents still ask about you." I laughed softly, bitter and light. "The same parents who supported you kicking me out?" He looked ashamed. "You should go," I said, standing. This part of my story, it doesn't include you anymore. He stood too. Elena, I'm sorry. I'm not, I said, meaning every word, because if you hadn't left, I wouldn't have found the life I was meant to live. He reached out instinctively, and I stepped back. Goodbye, Greg. I walked away, the bells on the cafe door chiming behind me. The street was bathed in golden light, and I stood on the corner for a moment, breathing in the late afternoon air. When I returned to Rachel's apartment, Grace ran to me, arms outstretched. I picked her up, held her tight. Jakey made mac and cheese, she said proudly, showing me cheese-streaked fingers. Jack stepped into the hallway, lifting an eyebrow. Everything okay? I nodded. More than okay. He smiled, but didn't push. That night, after Grace was asleep and Jack had gone home, I sat in the living room holding a photo of Maya. We did it, I whispered. She's safe, she's loved, and I am too. The wind rustled through the trees outside, and I swear I felt Maya in the room, quiet, proud, steady. I was no longer the woman hoping to be chosen. I was the woman who had chosen, again and again, to stay, to love, to build. And I would never look back. Grace turned too, with frosting on her cheeks and her arms wrapped tightly around a new stuffed elephant. This one soft pink, with sparkly ears and a matching bow that Jack had picked out weeks ago. She clutched it like it was sacred, the same way she once held on to Maya's old blue hippo, now a little frayed, but still tucked in beside her at night. The apartment was filled with balloons, streamers, and a banner that read "Happy Birthday, Grace," in childlike handwriting. Jack had helped her finger paint the letters. It was a mess. It was perfect. Friends came and went throughout the afternoon. Trish brought cupcakes with glitter sprinkles that got everywhere. Mrs. Chen from down the hall brought a red envelope with 2 crisp $20 bills tucked inside. Rachel arrived late, juggling a toddler of her own and a giant bag of toy blocks that Grace immediately dumped on the living room floor. I floated through the party in a state of half wonder, half exhaustion, watching it all unfold like a scene I once thought belonged to someone else's life. Jack held Grace on his shoulders while she squealed with delight. I caught his eye across the room, and he gave me a smile that said everything. We did this, together. After the last guest left, after Grace passed out in her crib, clutching both elephants like trophies, I found myself standing in the kitchen, watching Jack rinse dishes with his sleeves rolled up and that familiar crease in his brow. I can finish those, I offered. He shook his head. You hosted a party for 20 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. I can do the dishes. I leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching him work. She had the best day, I said. She won't remember any of it, but I will. I will too, he said softly. There was something in his voice, something deeper than usual. He dried his hands on a towel, turned to face me, and I saw it then. Not just affection, not just loyalty, love, not the rushed, hungry kind, the quiet, steady kind, the kind that shows up, that stays, that rebuilds. He stepped closer, close enough that I could hear the catch in his breath. Elena, I know we didn't plan this, any of it, but I wouldn't change a single step. Being part of your life, Grace's life, it's given me something I didn't even know I needed. I looked up at him, heart pounding. You've given her more than I ever expected, and me too. He brushed a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch light, tentative. Would it be crazy if I said, I want to be more than co-parents? I smiled, tears already forming. Only if I said no. The kiss was gentle, earnest, like a promise whispered between 2 people who'd already weathered 1,000 storms. We didn't define it that night. We didn't need to. Love didn't need a label. Not when it was already sewn into the fabric of every bedtime story, every scraped knee bandage, every shared moment of laughter and heartbreak. Over the next few weeks, something shifted, not abruptly, but in the quiet ways that matter. Jack started staying for dinner more often. Grace began calling him Daddy without anyone prompting her. He started keeping a toothbrush in the bathroom. We were careful, deliberate. We weren't rushing, but we were building. One night, after Grace was asleep, I pulled out the journal I'd been keeping for her, the one that started with shaky entries during midnight feedings and had grown into something like a love letter to our life. Today, I wrote, you called him Daddy. He didn't correct you. He just scooped you up and held you like he'd waited his whole life to hear it. I paused, then kept going. You don't remember your first steps, or your first laugh, or the day I promised your mother I'd raise you like my own. but I do. And I'll remember for both of us. Outside the window, spring had begun to bloom again. The trees lining our street were dusted with fresh green, and Grace's laughter filled the apartment every morning like sunlight. We'd outgrown the one-bedroom by then, but I hadn't wanted to move, not yet. There was something sacred about the space where we'd become a family. Every mark on the wall, every squeaky floorboard, carried a memory. But change comes whether you invite it or not. My blog, The Unexpected Mother, had continued to grow. I'd started writing more consistently, not just about motherhood, but about resilience, healing, forgiveness. One post, a letter to Maya on the anniversary of her passing, had gone viral. Suddenly, I was getting emails from publishers, podcast invites, book agents. One morning, while Grace colored at the table and Jack made pancakes, I opened an email that made my breath catch. A literary agent, offering a deal, a chance to turn our story into a memoir. I read the email twice, then a third time. Then I stood, crossed the room, and handed my phone to Jack. He read it slowly, then looked up, eyes wide. "Elena, this is huge." "It's surreal," I said. "But also, it feels right." He reached for my hand. "Tell the story, all of it. People need to hear it." So I did. The book took 6 months to write. I wrote in bursts during naps after bedtime, in the early mornings while the city was still quiet. I wrote about the moment I met Grace, about Maya's final words, about heartbreak and divorce and finding light in the ruins. I wrote about Jack, about how love didn't save us, but choosing each other did. The night I sent the final draft to my editor, I cried. Jack sat beside me on the couch, Grace asleep down the hall, and held my hand as I hit send. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You gave her a story to grow up with, and you gave the world a little more hope." The book was published the following spring. It wasn't a bestseller, but it reached people. Letters poured in from women who had taken in nieces, neighbors, stepchildren, men who had stepped into fatherhood without biology, people who needed to know that family isn't always blood. It's choice, it's love, it's showing up. One evening, we took Grace to the same park where I first let Jack push her on a swing. She ran ahead of us, chasing butterflies, her little legs strong and determined. Jack held my hand as we walked behind her, his thumb brushing mine in a quiet rhythm. "She's getting so big," he said. "She's ours," I replied. We reached the playground, and Grace turned back, calling to us with a grin that looked so much like Maya's it made my chest ache. "Come on, Mama." "Daddy?" I looked at Jack. He looked at me. And in that moment, standing on the same patch of grass where everything began, I felt it settle deep in my bones. We weren't the life I planned. We were better. We were the life I chose. Thank you so much for staying with us through this entire journey. Your presence means more than words can say. This story wasn't just about motherhood or second chances. It was about the quiet strength we find when life doesn't go according to plan. It was about showing up when it matters most, and learning that family isn't always something we're born into. It's something we choose, nurture, and fight for. Elena's path wasn't perfect, but it was real. And sometimes, the most beautiful lives are built from the pieces of broken plans. So tell us, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our community all around the world. Your stories matter too. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you of someone you love, please consider subscribing to our channel. We've got so many more stories to share about love, resilience, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people. You never know. The next story might just be yours. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and let's keep this beautiful conversation going.